Hello, class. I want to say good day. One of the benefits of doing online lectures is I'm sitting in my office here at home. You can see my books back in the back there. One of the negatives of doing it at home is I don't get to see you guys. I'm basically talking to my computer, looking at the slideshow screens that you guys normally see in class. So I'm sitting here talking to myself. Today we're going to go over the rise of big business. What is a monopoly? Was America monopolistic? Tycoons. And we're also going to get into the rise of big labor as well. Because to understand the United States today, and to understand American history from the late 1800s up through World War II especially, we have to understand that this was a different America than what had previously existed before the 1870s. This was an urban America. This was a corporate America. We take things like Walmart, General Electric, we take large economic entities for granted these days. This was not the case before the American Civil War. Most businesses, almost no businesses, were worth more than $1 million. Almost all manufacturing was still small scale. It was still mom and pop. It was still craftsmen. This, of course, will change. And at the forefront of this standardization is the railroad industry. The railroads are the first, what you might call, corporations. They're led by this fellow you see right up here. This fellow with the nice big beard here. This is Jay Gould. Jay Gould lived between 1836 and 1892. Jay Gould, on the one side, is seen as a man who will basically be at the forefront of railroad development. He will be a hero of industry in a sense, because he is the man who basically organizes railroads to be efficient and to help settle the West and become the infrastructure that industries will need in the future. However, Jay Gould is also, like many people in history, got his dark side. Jay Gould is a banker and financier by trade. So he's interested in making money, and he will use some what you might call underhanded tactics in order to capitalize and make money. He's really not interested in whether or not the railroads are successful per se. He's more interested in, do the railroads make money? And of course this will lead to some of the problems with labor. It will help lead to the downfall of railroads, because railroads will sort of have a bubble, if you will, in the 1870s, but by the end of the 1870s you will see that bubble burst and actually hurt the U.S. economy. At this time, large enterprises like railroad building is still done with personal assets. I mean, this is why banks play such a key role in not only the American economy today, but they play an even more important role in the American economy in the late 1800s, especially in the 1870s, because there's really no concept of the publicly owned corporation. Now, what is a publicly owned corporation? A publicly owned corporation is where a person, a single person, or even a partnership is not the controlling interest. The controlling interest are the shareholders. And at this time, you don't see very many, if any, entities, economic entities that are publicly traded, that is, they have shares or stock at this time. Jay Gould will be at the forefront of this idea of stock, of printing stock in order to fund his railroad building schemes. Now, Jay Gould will get into trouble because there's no, let's just put it this way, there's no criteria for how this is done. For example, what is the value of a stock? Well, the value of the stock is a combination of the value of the company as a whole plus how many shares of stock are in circulation. And it was not above Gould to announce that there are 200 shares of stock and put them up for sale when in fact he was selling 500 to 600 shares of stock. He's lying, or was lying. He, in a way, was guilty of fraud. So Gould will, well, be kind of a person of mixed character. Now, one of the things that Gould does do that does help the railroads expand is that he is going to buy up existing lines. Before the late 1860s, 1880s, or I should say 1870s, 1880s, railroad construction was done piecemeal by small companies. Again, you don't have large corporations building railroads. So small endeavors would build a one-track line to do a particular purpose. For example, the B&O, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, would be a single line that connects Baltimore to Cleveland, Ohio. You would have railroads that did nothing more than go from New York to Albany, New York. You would have railroads that would go from Nashville to Atlanta. And one of the problems of these early railroads is that there was no standardization. No standardization in organization, in terms of accounting and business practice, and especially equipment. If you ever hear about railroad gauge is the distance between the two tracks. At this time, the distance or gauge of the track could be very different. So if you were shipping something from, say, New York to Atlanta, there may be continuous track from New York to Atlanta. But since those different lines coming from one city to another might be owned by a different company, there may be different gauges. So you might go from New York to Cleveland, Ohio, and then have to put your cargo, take it from one train and put it onto another train because the train, the cars and the locomotives from the previous train could not run on the track that you were getting to in Cleveland. Jay Gould, as he buys up smaller lines and incorporating them into a nationwide system of rail, will standardize this equipment. He will also start to standardize organization. The rail industry will be the prototype, if you will, the progenitor of the corporate organization. Men like Gould will, in order to make the railroads cost effective, will divide them up according to region and according to function. Within these departments, you will have management. You will have a vice president for equipment, a vice president for accounting, a vice president for human, personnel management. They will have functional authority over their sphere of influence. Likewise, you will have directors of various regions: the Northeast region, the Northwest region, the South, the Midwest, and working together within this corporate arrangement. Gould and men like Gould hoped that the railroads would be able to quickly modernize, quickly fix broken rails, damaged rails, quickly move people and freight from one area to the other without delay, without cost overruns, to basically make the company work smoothly. Now finally, in order to do this, The railroads will actually need to change and standardize something that is outside the purview of the railroads. And this is literally the telling of time. Before railroads in the 1870s, how did people tell time? Well, since most Americans were farmers, they simply told time by when the sun was at its zenith, when it was highest in the sky. That's when they had lunch. When the sun came up, that's when they went to work. When the sun went down, that's when they knocked off for the day. That's why towns, every town had a courthouse with a clock, because here in Maryville or Knoxville, the time might be 10:03. But in the Tri-Cities, their time may be 10:10. Under normal circumstances, what's the problem? Here's the problem. Since most early rail lines between cities was a single line, so it had to accommodate trains going both directions, you needed to know when a train was leaving its station and heading to its destination. So if we use Knoxville and the Tri-Cities as an example, if the train is scheduled to leave at 10:05, in Knoxville it hasn't left yet. In the Tri-Cities, they think it's already left. But what happens if you're going the other direction? In the Tri-Cities, a train will leave. But in Knoxville, according to the time, it hasn't left yet. There may be a train in Knoxville on that line. And so many train collisions occurred because of this. Many of them head on. And these trains traveled at 30, 40 miles an hour a pop. So the combined impact speed was closing in on 100 miles per hour. So you need to organize time. You need to standardize it. And it is the railroads who will divide the country up into 4 time zones and standardize the time within those zones. Now originally they wanted to divide it up into 8 zones, but they simplified it to this. This is of course the time zones that we work under today. And within these time zones there is a standard time. You also see the need for improvement. And the railroads will consistently try and improve themselves both technologically and organizationally as they grow and evolve. One of the improvements that railroads will focus in on is safety. Not because they really, it's not that they're in business to be safe. They're in business to make money. But it's bad business if you kill your customer. And one of the chronic problems in the rail industry is how do you stop a train? How do you stop a train that's 20, 30 cars long, loaded with people and cargo? Well, the early way to do this was mechanically. The engine would literally be thrown into reverse, and each car had mechanical handbrakes with a wheel on top of the car. You would have brakemen that rode on every other car, and their job was to crank these wheels down. So they would do it on one car, jump to the second car they were supposed to be assigned to, and crank it down. This is a very dangerous job. You had men literally riding on top of the trains. In bad weather, especially going through mountains like the Rocky Mountains, the tops of these trains became slick with ice, and men would fall to their deaths underneath the trains. Sometimes the men would get cold and they would go inside the cars to warm up, but they wouldn't be on top of the cars and could not see the engineer's signal in time to crank down their brakes. So the delay would cause many train wrecks. By the late 1870s, the railroad industry would experiment and standardize what is known as a pneumatic brake or air brakes. And this is of course what railroads and trains use today. This is something that can be hooked to the locomotives, and with the simple throwing of a switch, the brakes on all the cars by the engineer would be engaged. No need for brakemen anymore. Now, the expansion of the railroads illustrated a key problem in big business, in making American business big. Because the need to create a corporation, to make an entity, if you will, that could be a standard entity, a nationwide entity, well, it needs capital. It needs money. It needs more money than even some of the wealthiest men in the United States could put up. So how do you get capital? You sell shares of the company. You sell stock. You divide the company up into percentage shares. The problem with stock at this time is a question of legal liability. Because if a train wrecks, who is responsible? Is it the engineer? Is it the president of the railroad company? Or do the shareholders themselves hold some culpability? Can they be sued? Can they be sued for more money than they have actually invested in the company? And this, of course, leads to people not wanting to buy stock. This dark gray area of law. They fear that if something happens, they could be liable. The response is that many states and also the federal government will pass what is known as limited liability laws. If you ever see a company that says Baird and Sons, LLC, the LLC stands for Limited Liability Corporation. This means that it's a publicly traded corporation. It has stock. What limited liability laws say is that a shareholder, a stockholder, can only be held responsible for the amount of money that that stock is worth. So I may buy a stock for $100. It may lose value, it may gain value. But whatever its value is, if something happens, if, for example, the company goes under, the creditors, the people the company owed money to, cannot come to me and say, your company owed us $3 million, and we're going to take everything you own. The only thing that they can take is the stock. And the stock may be worth only $70 at the time. That's all they can take. So limited liability gives incentive for people of wealth, people who have the discretionary income to buy stock and play the stock market, to get involved in the buying and selling of stock. But do you sell it on a street corner? Where do you sell stock at? The answer is Wall Street. Now, Wall Street had sold limited amounts of stock before this. However, Wall Street was really a commodities market before the American Civil War. What are commodities? Well, commodities are gold, silver, raw materials, lumber, frozen concentrated orange juice, pork bellies. These are commodities. It's after the American Civil War that you start to see Wall Street becoming a true stock market, not a commodities market. But still, even if you are playing Wall Street, do you personally, as a wealthy investor, go to Wall Street? Well, originally, yeah, you had to. But the expansion of the selling of stock would lead to modern investment banking. At the forefront of this move is this man right here. This right here is J.P. Morgan. Excuse me, my nose is itching. J.P. Morgan was also already a wealthy banker before he got involved in the stock market. However, he would gain incredible amounts of wealth in his later years. He lived from 1837 to 1913, basically coming to control the stock market, being very influential on the stock market. His bank, the so-called Morgan Bank, is still around. Today it's called the Chase Morgan Bank. But the Morgan Bank would concentrate not on loaning you money, not loaning you money for a house, not taking care of your savings account or checking account, but the Bank of J.P. Morgan was an investment bank. It was concentrating with the buying of companies through stock acquisition, and selling of companies. Now, what do you need to really benefit from the buying and selling of stock? You need to know information. You need to know about the actual industry the stock is involved, or the company is involved in. And this requires communications, improved communications. After the Civil War, or immediately after the Civil War, communications were relatively slow. They were still more bound by the U.S. mail, especially when it came to businesses out west. If you were communicating with California, you had to send a letter. And if you were in California and you were sending information back about gold or silver strikes in Nevada, you had to send a letter back all the way east. And remember, before 1868, there was no transcontinental railroad. So how did they get there? It literally was carried in the pouch of a rider. Between 1860 and 1861, this was known as the Pony Express. However, the Pony Express would be quickly superseded by the telegraph. Being laid alongside the first transcontinental railroad were telegraph lines. Telegraph lines would quickly expand across the United States like a spider web. Now, the telegraph had been around since the 1840s. But it wasn't until the late 1840s that you could actually talk with a telegraph. People in the Western world knew that electrical signals could be sent back and forth over long distances, but you needed some form to understand these signals. And so it's not until 1848 that you have this. Morse code. Dots and dashes. The interesting irony of Morse code is, while it is used on an analog machine, the telegraph, this is basically binary code. The same thing your computer uses. Your computer uses zeros and ones. This uses dashes and dots. Now, with the laying of telegraph line throughout the United States, and especially, most importantly, connecting the West Coast with the more built-up East, this allows for people buying stock, investors, to check the health of lumber companies in places like Wisconsin, to check the health and productivity of mine companies in California, to know the cotton, current cotton price and the production of cotton in the South. And also, simply put, they could know the day-to-day trading of stock on Wall Street. They didn't have to actually be at the stock market on Wall Street. They could be getting information off of this machine. This right here is a ticker tape machine. This is an early form of automated reader, so that as signals came in, it would print them off. It would decipher the dashes and dots into letters and numbers. So this would allow people like J.P. Morgan to remain in their main office in New York City, blocks away from Wall Street, but still know exactly what's going on Wall Street. According to sort of a kind of myth, J.P. Morgan had 3 of these machines in his office alone, his own office, not just his bank, which probably had more. He had 3 of them in his office by himself. Now, the ticker tape machine could also be used for more things than just stock information. By 1851, you have what are known as wire services. These are services that provide news, not just stock information, but news to the public. Basically, if you were the Knoxville News Sentinel, before the 1850s, the newspaper was full of only local news. But how did you get up-to-date national news? You got it through the wire services. These wire services would send out reporters, talk about things like What's going on Wall Street? What's going on in Washington, D.C.? What's going on the West Coast? What's going on in the rest of the world? And they would put this out on the wire. And if you had the money, as say a larger newspaper like the Sentinel, you would have your own ticker tape machines that would be printing this stuff off. And all you would have to do is take that information, those stories, already pre-made. You don't even have to write the story. That is the story coming off the wire. And all you have to do is typeset it on the printing press and print it off. Also, in 1851, a company will be founded that will allow individuals to go to their offices and send messages via telegraph. And then, of course, at the receiving station, they would put these on a little slip of paper. They literally take the ticker tape and cut it up, paste it to a little piece of paper, hand it to a runner, usually a young boy, and he would run it to various offices or even residences for a nominal fee. This is, of course, the birth of Western Union. Who provides all of this hardware? Who provides the wires? Who provides the ticker tape machines? And then later, what would replace the ticker tape machine? Something called a teletype. Basically a typewriter that when you type it in, instead of it typing in right there in front of you, it sends it out, and another teletype machine will print it off like a typewriter. Well, this, of course, will be provided by companies like Atlantic Telegraph. Atlantic Telegraph in 1876 will become Atlantic Telegraph and Telephone, AT&T. AT&T started out providing the hardware to these services. Now let's talk about businesses themselves. What are these businesses that people are investing in? Well, these early businesses will start out with strong, powerful, and wealthy individuals at the helm, even though they will become publicly traded companies. To understand the rise of big business, it's best to look at the three most influential businesses besides the railroad. This is the steel industry, the meatpacking industry, and the oil refining business. Let's look at steel. Well, before the 1870s, steel was relatively expensive. Before the 1850s, steel was insanely expensive, because before 1850, it took highly skilled, what were known as ironmongers, to puddle, what was called puddling steel. It was an art, a craft. However, in 1851, the Kelly-Bessemer process will be perfected. The Kelly-Bessemer process uses a blast furnace in order to impart carbon into the iron structure, thus producing steel. However, it will take a man of vision in order to capitalize on this new creation, the Kelly-Bessemer converter. This man right here, the one with the nice white beard, this is Andrew Carnegie, which will have the forethought to basically risk everything to invest in steel blast furnaces and not stick with just iron production. So what is Carnegie's background? Well, Carnegie is an interesting character in that he came to this country from Scotland as a preteen, not a young child, but not a teenager yet, orphaned, and he starts out by working as a runner and then later a telegraph operator for the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. While there, he will be befriended by the president of that company. Now, the Pennsylvania Railroad was, again, one of these small one or two line railroads. It wasn't a national railroad. It basically was operating between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. Carnegie will become the personal telegraph operator for the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and as such will be able to watch and learn from the president and the other high-ranking officials within the company how this company runs. What are the needs of the railroad? Well, one of the things that he learns is that the railroads are limited in both their safety and their carrying capacity by the material that the railroads are built out of. Railroads were practically iron. Not steel, iron. The locomotives were made out of iron. The rails were made out of iron. Now, iron, while a hard and good building material, has several limitations that are critical to a railroad. Because iron can be made to be flexible, called malleable iron, or it can be made to be rigid, like cast iron, like a cast iron cooking pot. How many of you have seen a family heirloom pot and it's got chips in it, or it's got a broken handle? This is common in cast iron because when you make it rigid, it becomes brittle. It's strong, but it's not flexible. It's not resilient. Malleable iron is resilient. It can take a sharp impact. The problem is it normally bends under that. Well, you really can't use either one effectively in railroad construction. Rails need to be firm. They can't bend like malleable iron, so they were made out of cast iron. But you had many rails that would break and cause trains to derail. You would make the locomotives out of malleable iron because rigid iron would literally explode. You're basically making a bomb. The problem was with malleable iron, over time, the stresses of the locomotive would literally bend the railroad or the locomotive, especially the boiler, out of shape, thus causing it to fail. Again, you're making a bomb. Steel, on the other hand, is both flexible but also rigid at the same time. And what Carnegie will do is, as he grows up to be a young man, he will use the lessons that he learned from the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, as well as his advice to invest in his first iron foundries. Now, in the 1870s and 1880s, Carnegie will do something that many thought was suicidal. He would run his iron furnaces at full capacity. The danger of this was that he was burning the equipment up. He was literally destroying his foundry. But here's the gamble. By producing the maximum amount of iron his foundry could put out, he was able to undercut the price of his competitors, thus cornering the market with the railroads, who were expanding at this time. He invested immediately in Kelly Bessemer's steel blast furnaces. Thus, when the day was over with, he was in a position to provide steel for about the same price that his competitors were providing iron. Of course, this put him at an advantage to his competitors, and he was able to buy them up, building this huge corporate entity known as Carnegie Steel. To show you how much Carnegie Steel would be worth, by 1901, Carnegie would sell out to J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan was already in the steel industry, but Carnegie Steel overshadowed his company. He wanted to combine the two into a massive super corporation. In 1901, he would offer Carnegie $480 million for Carnegie Steel. That's $480 million in 1901 dollars. Calculated for inflation, that's somewhere between 13 to 15 billion with a B today. Of course, Carnegie is not going to pass this up, and he sold out. He became one of the richest men in the world, selling out to J.P. Morgan. It also shows the wealth of J.P. Morgan, being an investment stock banker, in that he is able to offer what amounts to $15 billion and still be considered one of the wealthiest men in the world. During his lifetime, J.P. Morgan was the richest man in the world. And he would remain the richest man in the world not only because of his banking empire, but because he would be at the helm of U.S. Steel. The combination of his own steel assets with that of Carnegie created a corporation that was so huge that it would dominate the steel industry and become almost a near monopoly. U.S. Steel during World War II, for example, would produce 85 to 90% of all steel in the United States. I mean, this was a huge corporation. Now, Carnegie, in creating Carnegie Steel, showed many of his contemporaries the lessons that you would need to follow in order to be successful. You would have to have a desire to innovate. Always stay on the cutting edge of technology, or you get left behind. Know your industry, because it was Carnegie's personal ties and knowledge of the railroad industry that allowed him to know what and how to undercut his competitors. A contemporary of Carnegie was Gustavus Swift. How many of you have eaten anything like Swift meats? Or Swift had a competitor, a fellow by the name of Hormel, who would follow in Swift's footsteps in terms of how he ran his business. Now, what is Swift's contribution to modern industry? Swift is at the forefront of what is known as vertical integration. Now, Carnegie had started this with Carnegie Steel. Carnegie had bought up iron ore mines, had bought up various elements to guarantee that he had access to raw materials. But Gustavus Swift will literally buy up everything needed from the raw material to the finished product and do everything in between. This is known as vertical integration. Like, for example, Swift would contract directly with ranchers and cattlemen, guaranteeing him access to meat. He would buy up rail lines or rail cars, guaranteeing him transportation of those animals from railheads in the American West to his headquarters in Chicago. From there, within the factory, he would basically de-skill the butchering process in order to save money. So instead of hiring highly skilled butchers, he instead would set up what amounts to a disassembly line, where the animals are come in, one person kills it with a stun gun or a gunshot to the head, another 2 or 3 people skin it, another person splits it down the middle, another person guts it, takes out all the entrails, another person takes that half, that side of beef as it's known, and cuts off a certain section of it. Then down the line they cut off another section. Then down the line they cut off another section, so that by the end it is one product, a cow, being sent down a main disassembly line where feeder lines are being pulled off, where you have the front section, the pork belly, the hindquarters, the beef tips, all of these being pre-packaged into large sections. Now, they're not actually making the steaks, cutting the steaks, but they're cutting the animal up into sections in which a local butcher would simply just cut off the thickness of steak or thickness of stew meat or whatever that you were looking for. That instead of them cutting up the animal there at the butcher where you're buying it from, this meat is already butchered. However, Swift has a problem. If you're butchering the animal in Chicago, how do you get it to the lucrative markets in the East? Philadelphia, Boston, and especially New York City. Meat in these cities is expensive because the cattle industry directly outside of, say, New York City, is in direct competition for land with the city that it's providing the meat to. As the city expands, these farmers that provide the cattle are being pushed farther and farther away. Meat that is already butchered in Chicago won't make it there fresh. It'll be getting kind of rank by the time it gets there if you're just shipping it in an open boxcar. So Gustavus Swift turns to technology. He will invent the very first refrigerated container, the refrigerated boxcar. He will capitalize on the fact that Chicago is based on, or located on, one of the Great Lakes, Lake Michigan. So during the winter, he would send out teams to cut up the ice that could be 2 to 3 feet thick, drag it to man-made caves outside of Chicago, where it will be stored, packed in sawdust. Sawdust was a product of another growing industry in that area of the country, the lumber mills. And of course they could get it cheap because sawdust was practically worthless. In the summer, they would go into these caves, the sawdust keeping most of the ice intact. They would take the ice out and put it in cars. They would also put it in small boxes that were built into the special refrigerated cars, because these refrigerated cars were insulated. They had air passages in the walls that allowed the cold air from the ice to flow down, thus kind of sealing off the boxcar, entering at the bottom and then exiting out the back. The cars that come along with the train that hold surplus ice or excess ice, when the ice in the refrigerated cars all melts, you take it out of that boxcar and you put it in, thus ensuring the meat stays at a, well, relatively cold temperature all the way from Chicago to America's East Coast. This allows Swift to undercut the local butchers. I mean, think about this. He's doing butchering on an industrial scale. He's no longer having to hire skilled butchers, because he only has to train the people at each station with that particular job. Cut off the right leg. That's it. You don't have to pay them as much. This, of course, is known as vertical integration. Now, there's another man who will come to dominate another key important industry in America during this time period. This, of course, is John D. Rockefeller. This man right here. This is John D. Rockefeller. Today, the Rockefellers are probably some of the richest people in the United States. A lot of people say that they have an undue influence on the American economy and American politics. How they got this way is because of the sort of patriarch of the family, John D., cornering the market on oil refining. Now, John D. Rockefeller is from Cleveland, Ohio. He got started in the oil refining business because the first place oil was discovered in the United States was western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio. This would be the center of oil refining before the discovery of oil at the Spindletop location in Texas. That would be about the late 1880s, 1890s. So Rockefeller realizes that the one aspect of oil refining that has to be done, or of the oil industry, I should say, is that it be refined. It has to be refined, because crude oil in its natural state really doesn't burn that well. It's nasty. It stinks. It has the consistency of melted chocolate. It looks kind of like melted chocolate. And so it has to be refined. However, the refining process of oil is still an early science during the days of John D. Rockefeller. If it is not refined correctly, the finished products of oil refining could be downright dangerous. The main product that people want at this time is not gasoline. It's kerosene. Kerosene for lamps, kerosene for cooking. Gasoline is basically a waste product that is burnt off or thrown away, or even just poured out on the ground by early oil refiners. The problem is sometimes a little gasoline stays in the kerosene, and it doesn't fully mix with it, so you have little globules of gasoline floating around in the kerosene, but you really can't see it until that gasoline gets in the wick, goes up to the flame, and explodes. It just doesn't blow out. When it blows up, sometimes it cracks or shatters say, the kerosene lamp, throwing burning kerosene all over the place. So how does John D. Rockefeller corner the market? Well, he hires chemists to perfect kerosene, to make it safe. He markets his kerosene as the standard of the industry, thus calling his company Standard Oil. Now, it is the fact that John D. Rockefeller's kerosene is seen as safer than his competitors, which will allow him to get a sort of an edge in the market. But it's also Rockefeller's savvy business sense and sometimes even cutthroat tactics that allows him to dominate it. For example, the railroads by the 1870s and 1880s, as we will talk about, are not the super lucrative, highly profitable businesses that many thought that they would be. The railroads are only as profitable as what is being shipped on them. If people are not traveling on them, and especially if people aren't shipping freight on the railroads, they lose money. And so John D. Rockefeller has a lot of oil, or a lot of kerosene, a lot of oil products to ship out, thus putting him in a position to dictate price to the railroads, not vice versa. He simply says that if you guys do not ship my oil, since it is in such high demand, I will ship it with other means. And thus he can dictate a lower shipping price than his competitors can. And so what does Rockefeller do with his ever-increasing amounts of wealth? Well, he buys up his competitors. He buys up other oil refiners. And what happens is Standard Oil will come to dominate not the oil industry, because Rockefeller is not going to be highly involved in the actual acquisition of oil. He's not going to be drilling it. He doesn't own oil rigs. He's not selling it at the retail level like Gustavus Swift. He is only focusing on acquiring a dominant position in the refining of oil. This is known as horizontal integration, where you have just one aspect of an industry and you dominate it. And of course, if you dominate this key aspect, oil has to be refined. You have a powerful influence over prices and supply. So what are the achievements of big business? Well, whether we like corporations or not, we need them for cheap products, because corporations are able to reach what is known as an economy of scale. We see this with U.S. Steel and steel production. What is an economy of scale? Well, in economics, a product, just a generic product, they call a widget. So this mouse, this is a widget. If I, as a craftsman, have to make this mouse from start to finish, crafting every part, finding the material, making it, this product is going to be incredibly expensive. However, if I am a large corporation that has, well, either has direct control or good contracts with plastic producers, I have an assembly line that makes each individual part. I have different employees that put this thing together, and I can make not just tens, not just hundreds, but thousands of these things every year. The individual cost of this widget drops incredibly. That is an economy of scale. The more you produce, the cheaper each unit of production is. The problem is you need a big production facility. You need a huge factory, or you need several factories. Carnegie Steel, for example, it wasn't just one steel foundry. Carnegie owns 6 or 7 of them around the Northeast. In order to control this new corporation, you need management. You need a managerial staff. So it is these early corporations that give us white-collar America. And who is white-collar America? White-collar America is a new class, a whole new class of people known as the middle class. The middle class of America originally were people that were professional. They were professionals. They were either technicians, engineers, managers. Store owners, like grocery store owners, they provided support services to industry or to the people who worked in industry. They were not independent of themselves. They were not the yeoman farmer. They were not the general store owner out west. Instead, these are individuals that are either directly or indirectly tied to other large corporate interest. They're directly tied to it because they work for them. They are the managers on the floor. They are the technicians coming up with, well, what is this thing? I'm an engineer. I design it. Then I send it to the technicians to figure out how to set up the machines to build it. The floor bosses on the floor tell the workers how to build it. Those people are the managers. They are the white-collar managers. So we can thank this evolution of corporations, of big business in America, for giving us mid-level management. Now, the benefits of this is that mid-level management is better paid than just being a worker. And we'll talk about this here in a bit. However, the middle class is still, it's dependent. It is a dependent class. Middle class, even though they might own their own home, they get a good paycheck every day, they're still dependent. I'm middle class, and I'm dependent upon the school, Pellissippi State, for my paycheck. We see technological innovation because of the rise of big business. I've already talked about railroad brakes, so let's talk about skyscrapers. Before the advent of cheap steel, there was a limit to how high you could make buildings. In the 1880s, one of the last completely brick buildings was built in Chicago. This is known as the Monadnock Building. This would appear to be a skyscraper by any definition of the term. It's a large building. But it is so big that the weight of the floors on the top of the building is so great on the structure below it that its brick walls on the ground floor are 6 feet thick. There are no rooms on the bottom floor because there's no space for rooms on the bottom floor. There's just hallways, stairwells, and elevator shafts. That's it. So the higher you go, the less you can put on the bottom floors. Until this building. This building right here is one of the first buildings in Chicago. Whoops, let me go back. Right here. It looks like a brick building, but it is not a brick building. It is a brick facade building, but it has a steel skeleton. It is one of the first buildings in the United States to have an internal frame, a steel frame. And this innovation of steel frame construction will allow cities to grow not just out, but they start to grow up. I mean, just think about how big New York or Chicago would be if the skyscrapers were limited to 10 stories tall. That was it. If they couldn't be any taller, well, to put it bluntly, you couldn't have the cities that we have today. We couldn't have the population in these cities. Now, what are some other technological innovations? Well, if you look at the cities, here's a picture of I believe this is New York City in the late 1800s. Look at the streets. It's a traffic jam. There are people all over the place. You have these trolleys working. These are early electrically driven trolleys. But you still have congestion. Well, what's the solution? Well, the solution is both mass transit above ground, but more importantly, mass transit below ground. In 1897, the United States has its first subway open. Not the subway, sandwich shop, but the actual subway train. And it's not in New York. The first city to get a subway is Boston. However, the city that will become almost synonymous with subways is, of course, New York City. And the subways will allow a lot of these people to go underground. Now, another achievement of big business is simply put, more stuff at cheaper prices. The fact that you have laptops, the fact that you have iPhones, the fact that you have cars that somebody 100 years ago would marvel at, not only the fact that it's mere transportation, but it has air conditioning, it has, electric seats, it has electric windshield wipers, it has electric headlights on it. They would marvel at this because at the time that we're talking about now, there are early automobiles, but the cost, if you changed it to today's dollars, would be, to get a car that literally was just an open air, an open wagon with an engine in the 1890s would still cost you as much as buying an SUV today. Why is it that our cars aren't super expensive? Because of all the stuff that the improvements. It's because, again, of the achievements of quantity or production by economies of scale. However, there's some downsides to big business, as we'll talk about in later lectures. One is their size. Standard Oil will become seen as a leviathan, as a giant octopus, as you see in this early editorial cartoon, reaching out for the White House, already having its tentacles around the U.S. Capitol building and state capitals, crushing opponents. Other industries, like for example, this is the flag of not the Pittsburgh Steelers. They stole it. They borrowed it. This is actually the symbol of J.P. Morgan's U.S. Steel. These businesses will become so large, so influential, so economically powerful that opponents of big business will see them as giant walking bags of money that come into state houses, or in this case the Senate chamber of the U.S. Congress, and be able to sit in the back and dominate the small little senators. And of course the people's balcony is closed to the public. Some of this criticism is earned because these wealthy individuals will use their power. They will use their influence to dominate not just the American economy, not just to run out small competitors, but also to influence lawmaking, to influence tax policy. I'll tell you about the controversy over the establishment of the Federal Reserve when we have class again. And this influence, this power, not only economic power, but social and political influence, will come to be sort of the hallmark of what becomes known as the robber baron class. Because the robber barons will sit atop a new economic order, an industrial order, an order where you have a few monopolies, but really it is dominated by oligopolies. What is a monopoly? I want you guys to think about that for a minute. What is a monopoly? I want to ask you on a quiz, what is a monopoly? Well, it means where one industry is dominated by one company. What's an oligopoly? It means rule by few. You see very few true monopolies at this time, but you see a lot of oligopolies. What is a oligopoly? Is where an industry, say for example oil or meat packing or steel, are instead dominated by two or three powerful industries or powerful companies or powerful people. Now what if those three companies collude with each other? They come together. They know each other. You know, the people who run them come from the same social class. They collude. They agree with each other that we're going to lower our prices to below the cost of manufacture to basically destroy our smaller competition. That's one of the things that oligopolies tend to do. Now you might be saying, well, why doesn't one of the big businesses take advantage of that to, destroy the other two? Well, they have too much to lose, not just economically, but in terms of socially, because you see the formation of what you might call a new governing class, a new influential class, an upper class at this time. And this new social order is it's supported by the fact that the wealthy in this country are sending their children to the same schools, the Ivy League. Can you guys believe that Harvard and Yale originally started out as seminaries? They turned out preachers and pastors. However, during the course of the late 1800s, these schools will be transformed by heavy investment of elite individuals. People like J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and other individuals will basically give money to these elite institutions, these elite schools. But of course, this money comes with strings. They're going to have a heavy influence on the course of how this school develops. What is its curriculum? How is it going to look like? And it's not just about learning. You don't go to Harvard and Yale to learn anything. You really go to Harvard and Yale to network. That's why the rich send their kids to Princeton, to Harvard and Yale. Because there they can make connections with people like themselves. Likewise, the rich want to live in their own neighborhoods. Now, before this rise of corporate America, where did the rich live? They lived outside of places like New York City. If you look on a map, north of New York City, you have first Westchester, and then farther north you have places like Hyde Park, New York. They're connected to New York City by a singular rail line and also the Hudson River. But you don't want to have to travel that far if you're having to work in New York City all the time. Like, for example, J.P. Morgan wants to stay in constant contact with the city. He wants to be in the city in order to make business deals and keep on top of the stock market. So you need a townhouse. This is the birth and the growth of Fifth Avenue. Fifth Avenue in New York City, on the, I believe it's the north side, or no, it's not the north side. It may be the west side. I think it might be the west side of Central Park. This will become sort of the elite part of New York City, the elite section of the city. Of course, this is where all the rich will live. They'll shop in the same places. They'll see each other on the street. They'll go to the same clubs. Now, where do they go? Do they go to the same bar that you or I would go to, or the same grocery store, or the same place to recreate? No, they don't. The rich will build their own society, if you will, by what historians call conspicuous consumption. The reason why Broadway and Broadway theaters are in New York City is because of the patronage of wealthy individuals. The reason why every major U.S. city, including Knoxville, for example, will have theaters, symphony orchestras, operas, and things like that, is that the wealthy will conspicuously consume. Not only will they patronize, they'll go to and buy tickets to these areas, but they will publicly make a big deal of donating money to the Knoxville Symphony Orchestra. They'll be behind the fundraising drives. They'll be the head of various organizations to beautify their cities. The reason why they're doing this is not just to lend support to worthwhile causes. The reason why the wealthy get behind worthwhile causes is to justify their position in society. That's why it is conspicuous consumption, not just consumption. Many critics of Andrew Carnegie, for example, will argue that he is not the philanthropist that he claimed to be as he gave away his money, especially after he is bought out by J.P. Morgan. Instead, he is a man masquerading as a philanthropist, founding libraries, founding Carnegie Mellon University, founding the Carnegie Endowments for the Arts, in order to basically rebuild his reputation that has been soiled by his actions as an industrialist. And we'll talk about some of them here in a bit. And of course, another way of conspicuous consumption is, of course, to build and maintain those estates outside of the cities, those what they called summer homes. Can you believe Biltmore Estate was considered a summer home? Yes, that was a summer home. They didn't, the Vanderbilt family, being one of the wealthy families of America at this time, was quite large, and there were multiple different Vanderbilts. But the Vanderbilt that built Biltmore Estate, that to him was a summer home. If you watch the X-Men, Professor Xavier's house is actually one of the estates in Westchester. Remember, I told you Westchester is just north of New York City. We'll talk about the need to conspicuously consume and what that means to American society in class on Monday. I'm getting kind of ahead of myself here, but who actually supports the robber barons? Because they're not really supporting themselves wholly. They need the support of the middle class, because it's the middle class who provides the expert advice. It's the middle class who are the people who actually run the oil refineries. It is the middle class who actually manage the meat packing factories. It's not the elite class. So, in a way, the robber barons need the middle class. They have to have them. And the middle class actually recognizes this. If you look at middle class publications, if you look at some of the diaries of middle class individuals, they fully understand that without the middle class, the upper class of America would basically collapse. And for this reason, they have a sort of a love-hate relationship with the upper class. They respect the upper class for the money that they invest in corporations. They respect them for the factories and the economic endeavors. They respect them to some degree for the things that they bring to the table, like operas and theaters and things like that. But they also look down upon the upper class, because the upper class is seen as spoiled. It's seen as decadent. They look at the children of the upper class, especially those that go to elite institutions like Yale and are barely making a C, but they grow up to be, well, industrial leaders, or in our case, a former president of the United States. The middle class are the educated class. The middle class are the ones that have to be professional, educated. They have to be this way or they don't get their position. They have to earn it by merit. They view the upper class as people who are born with silver spoons in their mouth. And thus the middle class will have a completely different set of individual and social values from the upper class that stresses merit, accomplishment, and frugality. We'll delve into this greater on Monday as well. Now there's a whole other class that is created at this time. This, of course, is the American working class. Let's get into talking about them and how the modern American worker is born. Because before the American Civil War, the American worker was a highly skilled craftsman. This is a man who knew how to make his product from start until finish. If you were a clockmaker, you could build a clock from raw wood all the way up to the finished product. How did you become a master craftsman? Well, you became a master craftsman by being an apprentice, then becoming a journeyman, and then finally, hopefully, a master. And many would never reach the level of master. This is an outgrowth of the old medieval guild system. A system that, for the most part, had broken down, but still had this vestige of apprentice, journeyman, and master. Now, where does the craftsman's power comes from? Well, his power comes from the craft. It comes from his skill, his knowledge. Even after he loses financial control of his industry, he still has a lot of influence over it, because knowledge is power. So how does he lose the financial control? Well, after the American Civil War, Bankers and financiers are looking for industries to invest in. Craftsmen are looking to expand and they need money. So these two groups work out basically a deal. Bankers will invest money for the craftsmen to expand operations. But this comes with this is a double-edged sword for the craftsmen, because financially craftsmen start to lose control of their industry. Because if I'm a clockmaker and I make clocks and I want to hire more people, I want to expand my shop, I go into business partnership with a banker. They provide 50% of the capital, or they provide 50% of the growth because of the capital. I provide 50% in the form of knowledge and skill. But who actually controls the business at that point? Well, it's not just me anymore. The banker has an equal say. But what happens if the banker invests a lot more money than that? It means that financially, I am not in control of the company, especially when these companies become publicly traded. It is now controlled by boards of directors. It is now controlled by financial interests. And financial interests have different prerogatives than that of the craftsman. The craftsman's prerogatives is that of the craftsman. For example, if I'm a craftsman and I finish my clock at 3:30 in the afternoon, am I going to start another one and only work another hour basically? No, I'm going to knock off for the day and go home. If I control my business and I feel like taking a longer lunch break, I am. I'm going to go and take a 2-hour lunch break. But the financial interest, they're not concerned with your prerogatives. They want efficiency. They want profit. So they want you to work from 8 until 5. And back then it was more like 8 until 7. They wanted you to go to lunch and take a 30-minute lunch and be back in the factory. They did not respect the craftsman's prerogatives, and they would push for more streamlined production procedures. The only thing protecting the craftsman was the fact that without the craftsman there was no product. His power and influence and his ability to negotiate was based on the fact that he held that key power, that key knowledge. Of course, this will change with the de-skilling of the American worker. As early as the early 1800s, you will see the introduction of what is known as mass production. What is mass production? Mass production is not just making a lot of stuff. Mass production is how you make that lots of stuff. And it has its origins with a man by the name of Eli Whitney. Whitney was a master gunsmith and needle maker. I don't know why hat needles or anything like guns, but he was. He made needles and he made guns. Now Whitney had tried to make his fortune in the late 1790s by inventing what is known as the cotton gin. However, he did not patent that device, and his competitors would reverse engineer it, and Whitney would only see a nominal profit from it. So still seeking to make his fortune in the early 1800s, he will look to the U.S. military. The military is always in need of guns. As a gunsmith, he can provide them. However, why would the U.S. military buy Whitney's guns when they have a massive arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts? Well, Whitney will find a niche. He will find a gimmick. He latches onto the idea of interchangeable parts. And how do you get interchangeable parts? Well, Whitney would take his journeymen, the people that worked under him, and instead of having one guy make an entire gun from start to finish, he would say, this guy is going to make only the barrels. This guy is only going to make the stocks. This guy is only going to make the hammers. This guy is only going to make the trigger assemblies. And the final guy will put them all together. According to sort of the history of this, Whitney finally gets an audience with the Ordnance Corps, the people who make the guns for the U.S. Army. They're not impressed by the fact that he's produced about 10. I think it was 9 guns that he made. However, they are impressed when Whitney tells his workers to disassemble all the guns, mix up the parts, and put them back together again. In doing so, 7 of the 9 guns fire. Why is this important? Well, on the battlefield, if you have a gun that has a blown-out barrel and another one with a hammer that's broken, the idea of being able to take the hammer off the gun with the blown barrel and putting it on the other gun, you're able to take 2 guns that are broken and make one of them work without the need of getting a part from your supply chain. Today we take this type of replacement parts for granted. That your phone, your iPhone 5, is pretty much the same as other iPhones. This was not the case before the early 1800s. Guns that were made before Eli Whitney, while they may look similar, could not have parts taken off of one and put on another without major, what's known as fitting. Even after Whitney's idea of having only one guy make one part, you still had to worry about, was he making every part identical to each other? It's very hard to do. However, the Germans would solve this problem with the idea of gauges. A gauge is something built specifically for the manufacture of a part, a specific part. They're often known as go and no-go gauges. Again, I'm making my widget here, my mouse. I have a gauge that I'm filing down this mouse. I want to know when I've filed it down enough. If it fits in the go gauge, it means that it's small enough. I have another gauge though. It's called a no-go gauge. If it doesn't go in there, it means I've not made it too small. If it does go in the no-go gauge, it means that I've made it too small. It needs to be chucked in the trash. These gauges are made to tight tolerances. So if you've ever built an engine, a car engine for example, one of the things that you look at when you're making sure everything are within tolerances is that the parts are fitting together not exactly like they should, but they're within 5/100ths of an inch. That means that they're within spec. Now later on, they'll get rid of the need for individual gauges by actually putting the gauging on machines that make the parts. So instead of me filing out the widget here, I'll have a machine that presses these widgets out. And a trained technician, a white-collar, middle-class technician, is the guy responsible for every day making sure that these things are gauged right for an unskilled worker to use. These dedicated machines, as they become known, no longer need skilled workers, they need trained workers. There's a difference. A skilled worker knows how to make this thing start to finish. A trained worker is nothing more than a trained monkey pressing out these parts. And finally, labor loses its last ace card, because the one thing that labor can always fall back on is you need a certain amount of people. If there's not enough people, the people that you do have to do the job can ask a lot of money. But if you have a lot of people, more people than you need, then you don't have to offer a lot of money, because if that person doesn't accept it, somebody else will. And during the late 1800s, we see a massive influx of immigrants, mainly from the Mediterranean, Italy, and Eastern Europe, places like Russia, Poland, the Baltic states, the Balkans. And these individuals are just looking for a job, any job. And of course, this undercuts the asking price of American workers who are already here. And this causes tension between native-born Americans and Americans of immigrant descent. This is the same reason why many people fear illegal immigration from Latin American countries. They fear that the Latin American immigrants will undercut American labor here in this country today. Now, one of the first responses of this, one of the first to think of a response to this de-skilling of America are the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor is the first national organization aimed at unionizing American working class individuals, of giving American workers a common voice. It's formed in 1869. Now, the interesting thing about the Knights of Labor is that they are not a labor union in the sense that, well, they want to go on strike, that they want to fight management. Instead, they believe by educating the working man, both the native-born and the immigrant, they can create an organization that by its just sheer size can force management, money, to recognize their prerogatives, to recognize the cooperative commonwealth, as they call it. Now, this cooperative commonwealth is all-inclusive. It is inclusive of skilled labor as well as unskilled labor. It's not just limited to white people either. It includes women as well as blacks and immigrants. Now, this right here will cause a problem, because put yourself in the mindset of people in the late 1800s. Racial attitudes are still pretty sharp. Gender differences are still considered important. Men are seen as the breadwinner. Women are seen, well, they should stay home or at least do women's types of industries, like being a seamstress. Skilled labor is disdainful of unskilled labor, because even though the Knights of Labor are the first national union, they're not the first unions. You have local craft unions. These are unions that are organized around a certain craft, around a certain location. So you might have the Boston Coopers Union, or the New York Coopers, or the Knoxville Shoemakers. And these earlier craft unions don't like the fact that the Knights are trying to take over from them, but also take over from them and include unskilled workers, women, and blacks. And so these craft unions will basically fight within the labor movement against the Knights of Labor. It's these craft unions that will actually call for the first nationwide strikes. In May of 1886, these craft unions will call for a protest. They don't call them strikes just yet, but a protest against industry by basically making them work all the time. They're trying to get an 8-hour workday. They're rallying for the 8-hour workday. And so you have this nationwide strike called by the skilled labor unions. One of the first labor unions to represent only skilled labor, but it is a nationwide union, is the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. It's founded in 1881. So it is a competitor. It's an opponent, if you will, within the labor movement with the Knights of Labor. Now, its leader, Samuel Gompers, believes in active tension, active fighting against management, against the companies. And so it's easy to blame these strikers when a bomb is thrown in Chicago that explodes, killing, I believe, 2 police officers and wounding several others. That this is a product of the labor movement, not just some anarchist. This causes, of course, the Haymarket Square strikers to be suppressed by law enforcement, and tension to build between labor and management. We see this tension between labor and management again in July of 1892 in Homestead, Pennsylvania. Homestead was where one of Carnegie had one of his steel mills. Now, Carnegie at this time, remember, Carnegie at this time is acting the philanthropist. He's acting as this gentle old industrialist who's giving money to libraries and things like that. But at the same time, he has his second in command, one of his presidents, a man by the name of Henry Clay Frick, to destroy these strikers. These strikers are striking for collective bargaining. They want the company to have to create a union contract, a contract that applies to all the workers, so that the company cannot pit one worker against another by saying, okay, you're getting paid $10 an hour, well, we're going to hire these other guys in at $7 an hour. Instead, the strikers want them to all be paid one price. Carnegie sends in Henry Clay Frick, and Henry Clay Frick at first sends in hired guns called Pinkerton detectives. These are basically hired contractors. Initially, the strikers push back the Pinkertons. They surround them and force them to surrender. This action causes the local authorities to get scared, and local police are called in and suppress the strike. 2 years later, you will see another strike. This is at the Pullman plant outside of Chicago. Now, the Pullman company builds railroad cars. They build sleepers, they build dining cars, they build freight cars. Most of the cars that the railroad companies use are Pullman cars. Striking for both an 8-hour workday and collective bargaining rights, the workers at the Pullman plant basically shut down production. At the same time, railroad workers launch what is known as a sympathetic strike. They claim that they are supporting their fellow workers and refuse to handle any Pullman cars. They don't shut down the railroads. They will continue to operate the trains. They just refuse to operate any trains that have Pullman cars in them. They won't hook them up. They won't detach them. They refuse to touch them. Now, Pullman gets the U.S. government to intervene. Why? Why would the U.S. government intervene on the side of Pullman? Well, here's the interesting way Pullman gets the U.S. government under James Garfield to actually send in the U.S. military, the Army. They claim that the railroad workers not hooking up Pullman cars is interfering with the government's constitutional duty to deliver the mail. So the Army takes over from these railroad workers. It also suppresses the Pullman strike, thus ending both strikes, both the Pullman and the sympathetic strike. However, this will initiate a period between the late 1890s and the early 1900s of industrial war, where you see violent strikes, where you see industry trying to basically wear down workers, while workers themselves are trying to destroy the power of management. It will also radicalize the labor movement. The man who called the sympathetic railway strike against Pullman was a man by the name of Eugene V. Debs. He was the head of the American Railway Union. This, of course, represented all the railroad workers. Now, he is arrested as part of this suppression of the Pullman sympathetic strike. While in prison, he will form the American Socialist Party. Now, this is not communism. This is socialism. Socialism believes that the people should own the means of production. So they should own the factories. They should own the railroads. They should own the communication system. They should own banking. Now, when you say the people should own these things, does that mean that we all own it? No. Socialists believe that you need to have the government acting as the representatives of the people in order to, well, control them. Now, the difference between socialism and communism is that communism believes in violent revolution, whereas many socialists, like Eugene V. Debs, believe that socialism could be achieved through the vote, through the ballot. People would vote for socialist policies. As such, he would push socialist policies through law, but he would also run 3 times for president. Here's the last time that he ran, in 1912. The previous time that he actually ran for president while he was in prison. This doesn't mean that all American socialists believe in peaceful socialism. You have American Marxists. The the founding principle of communism. These are known as members of the International Workers of the World. Critics call them the Wobblies. Now, the IWW represents class struggle and violent revolution. However, they stress less of the violent revolution in like what you saw in Russia in 1917 and more struggle inside the factories. They argue for slowing down on the job, breaking tools, doing things to basically destroy the system from within. Now, this doesn't mean they're not above violent strikes. The IWW will later on get involved in the unionization of miners in places like West Virginia, and Eastern Kentucky. These IWW-inspired strikes are often very violent. Sometimes the violence is because of the Wobblies, sometimes it's because of the mine owners and their agents. Now, next class period, we'll talk about how the developments of big business and big labor play into the development of a uniquely new industrial urban American society. I've kind of blown through this lecture because I don't have interaction with you guys, so I'm kind of throwing out a lot of ideas that I want to revisit in the class. So don't think that we're done with this lecture. Think about it that we're going through this, and I want you guys to be able to bring up any ideas that you might have about this next class period or the class period after that. So continue reading the book. Look in the syllabus for the readings on this new American industrial urban society so that you'll be ready for Monday and also Wednesday. I'll see you guys later, and I apologize if this is kind of a boring lecture, but again, I'm talking to myself to my laptop. Bye-bye.